Get settled down and feel comfortable wherever you may be. Let the weight of your day drift away. Pull your blankets a little closer. Tonight, we're going to travel back through centuries, through mist and memory, to a time when the English islands was fractured into several small kingdoms. This was a time of hardship and endurement. This was the Dark Ages, where death was a constant companion. In these times, the Nordic raiders plagued the British Islands, plundering and pillaging their way until that very year that made history. The year that the Great Heathen Army invaded and changed the course of history for Europe forever. A time when a hero was being born, when the foundation for united England was laid. Come with me to learn everything there is to learn about one of history's greatest character. Come with me to the very beginning of where kingdoms rose from the blood and ashes and the ambition of men who refused to be forgotten. This is the life of Alfred the Great and the legacy he left behind. But before we start up the old time machine, there is something I want to ask you. How are you? I hope you all are fine and that you have had a good day. If you feel like it, I would really appreciate if you would like the video and perhaps even subscribe to my channel. It really would mean the world to me. But only if you really want to, of course. It gives me the motivation to keep creating these videos, and I really, really do appreciate it. Okay, now that is out the way, we can get going, and we start, of course, at the very beginning. In the middle of the 9th century, the land that would one day be called England was far from a unified nation. Instead, it was a patchwork of kingdoms, each asserting its authority, each wary of its neighbors, and each striving to maintain its own sense of identity and power. Across the rolling hills, dense forests, and fertile river valleys, a multitude of rulers navigated a complex web of allegiances, rivalries, and occasional warfare. The concept of a single English nation, ruled from one throne, remained a distant dream. At the northern edge of these isles lay Northumbria, a kingdom forged from the union of Bernicia in the north and Deira in the south. Stretching from the Humber to the Firth of Forth, Northumbria had once been a powerhouse of both political influence and religious learning. Monasteries like Whitby Abbey and the twin foundations of Monkwearmouth Jarrow were renowned across Europe for their scholarship, illuminated manuscripts, and devotion to God. Yet Northumbria was not peaceful. The kingdom's history was marked by internal strife, with rival claimants to the throne often vying for power, leaving the land vulnerable to external threats. Its principal city, York, served as both a hub of commerce and a strategic fortress, a prize that would later attract the attention of seafaring invaders from the north. Southward in the Midlands lay Mercia, a kingdom whose power had once dominated much of England. Mercia's kings wielded influence over neighboring territories through a mix of diplomacy, marriage alliances, and, when necessary, force of arms. By Alfred's youth, Mercia had lost some of its former dominance, but remained formidable, particularly due to the fertile farmland and the well-fortified towns under its control. Mercian nobles maintained vigilant oversight of trade routes, while their armies could be mobilized quickly to respond to threats, both internal and foreign. The kingdom's balance of power required careful navigation, as alliances could shift overnight and opportunistic neighbors, including Wessex, were ever watchful. To the east, the smaller but strategically significant kingdom of East Anglia lay along the coast, its rich rivers and ports making it particularly attractive to foreign raiders. Kings like Edmund faced a constant threat from the sea, their defenses limited and their security often reliant on alliances with stronger neighbors. East Anglia's wealth, derived from trade and fertile lands, made it both a prize and a liability in this turbulent age. In the south, Wessex was the kingdom that would later stand as the last bulwark against total Viking domination. Stretching roughly from the Thames southward and encompassing modern counties like Hampshire, Berkshire, and Wiltshire, Wessex was strategically placed, yet constantly under pressure. Its western neighbour, Cornwall, maintained a distinct cultural identity, resisting Anglo-Saxon assimilation. The royal estates of Wessex, such as the one near Wantage where Alfred was born in 849, served as administrative centres, hubs of economic activity, and symbols of the king's presence across the countryside. Yet Wessex's strength was continually tested, not only by ambitious neighbouring kingdoms, but increasingly by the rising threat from across the North Sea. Beyond the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, the Celtic Britons held on to lands in western regions, including Wales, Cornwall, and Cumbria. Their culture, language, and political structures remained distinct, with kingdoms such as Gwynedd and Dyfed maintaining their own hierarchies and traditions. To the north, the Scots, settlers from Dalriada in Ireland, had established footholds in western Scotland, blending Gaelic customs with local traditions. Farther north still were the Picts, a mysterious people whose language and culture remain partially obscured to modern historians. Their presence was recorded in place names, Ogham inscriptions, and the chronicles of later historians, leaving tantalizing glimpses of a culture both complex and resilient. Across the Irish Sea, communities in Ireland maintained their Gaelic language and political systems, sometimes raiding the British kingdoms themselves or forming temporary alliances, further complicating the geopolitical landscape. The linguistic and religious map of these islands was as diverse as the political one. The Anglo-Saxons spoke Old English, a Germanic language brought from the continent during the 5th century. Meanwhile, Celtic communities in Wales, Cornwall, and Cumbria spoke Brythonic languages, the ancestors of modern Welsh and Cornish. In Ireland and parts of western Scotland, Old Irish predominated. The Pictish language, largely undeciphered, survives only in inscriptions but hints at a rich and unique culture. Religion intersected with this diversity. Christianity had taken root across the Anglo-Saxon and Celtic worlds, yet many pre-Christian traditions lingered, especially in rural and frontier areas. Pagan beliefs, sacred groves and local rites persisted alongside churches and monasteries, creating a complex spiritual landscape. Society itself was rigidly hierarchical. At the top of the social pyramid were kings, ruling with the Council of Ealdorman, senior nobles charged with administering territories and leading troops in times of war. Beneath them were thegns, landholders who provided military service in return for land and status. The majority of the population were peasants, bound to the land and responsible for sustaining both the economy and the armies through their labor. Slaves, who may have constituted up to a quarter of the population, worked in households, on farms, and sometimes even on royal estates. Towns were sparse and relatively small. Only a few, like London and York, had developed into major centres of trade, political administration, and ecclesiastical authority. Ports, such as Hamwick and Ipswich, facilitated foreign trade, connecting England to continental Europe and beyond. Amid this complex and hierarchical society, a new threat began to emerge from across the North Sea. In the late 8th century, seafarers from Scandinavia, later called Vikings, began venturing into Britain. Initially, these raids were opportunistic, targeting monasteries and coastal settlements. The first recorded attack was in 789, when 3 ships from Hordaland, in modern Norway, landed on the southern coast at Portland. The raiders killed the local reeve, Beaduherd, a stark signal of the violence to come. Over the following years, these incursions escalated in ambition and scale. By 793, the Vikings struck at Lindisfarne, a monastery off the northeastern coast founded by St. Aidan in 635 GE. Lindisfarne was a centre of religious learning, art, and devotion. The Vikings arrived in swift, shallow draft longships, ideal for navigating coastal waters and rivers. They attacked suddenly, slaughtering monks, seizing treasures, and desecrating sacred relics. Contemporary chroniclers like Alcuin of York saw this as divine punishment, a portending of more violent incursions to come. Similar raids followed at Monkwearmouth Jarrow Abbey and the monastery at Iona, demonstrating both the Vikings' growing audacity and their capacity for coordinated attacks. The psychological shock reverberated across Christendom. Monasteries, once considered sanctuaries, were no longer safe. Over the next several decades, the raids grew into large-scale campaigns. The Vikings, largely Danish and Swedish, were no longer content with plunder alone. They sought territory, settlement, and political dominance. By 865, disparate bands of Vikings united into the Great Heathen Army, landing in East Anglia with the intention of conquest. This army, led by formidable figures such as Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and later Guthrum, swept across Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia. They captured York, deposed kings, and established a pattern of settlement that would permanently alter the landscape of England. It was into this turbulent and dangerous world that Alfred the Great was born in 849 at a royal estate near Wantage in Wessex. As the youngest son of King Ethelwulf, Alfred's early life was shaped by a constant awareness of the precariousness of kingdoms, the fluidity of alliances, and the ever-present threat of Viking invasion. Seas that had once separated lands were now highways for raiders. Rivers that had nourished commerce became routes for armies of invaders. From his earliest years, Alfred would witness the fragility of political order, the devastation of foreign incursion, and the vital importance of leadership, strategy, and vision. The stage was set. Alfred's life would unfold amid the collapse of old powers, the rise of new threats, and the struggle to defend not just a kingdom, but the cultural and political identity of the Anglo-Saxon people. The fractured Isles of England, with their diverse peoples, complex hierarchies, and looming menace from the north, formed the world into which the future king stepped. An England that was vulnerable, contested, and in desperate need of a unifying force. The early Viking raids and Alfred's formative years. The decades preceding Alfred's ascent to power were marked by a growing shadow of violence and uncertainty that hung over the British Isles. The first signs of this threat had emerged decades earlier, when Scandinavian raiders, drawn by wealth and opportunity, began crossing the North Sea. In the late 8th century, England's monasteries, symbols of learning, culture, and spiritual devotion, became the earliest and most vulnerable targets. Their treasures of gold, silver, and illuminated manuscripts, often accumulated over centuries, were irresistible to these swift and ruthless marauders. The attack on Lindisfarne in 793 CE remains the most infamous opening act of this turbulent period. The monastery, perched on a small island off the northeast coast of Northumbria, had been founded nearly 2 centuries earlier by Saint Aidan. Its monks lived in relative isolation, devoted to scholarship, prayer, and the creation of religious art. But this seclusion, which had been a blessing for contemplation, proved disastrous in the face of Viking longships sliding silently over the waves. On the morning of June 8, 793, the raiders landed, slaughtered the monks, desecrated holy relics, and plundered treasures. Contemporary chroniclers, including Alcuin of York, described the event with horror, calling it an unthinkable manifestation of divine wrath. The psychological impact rippled through the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Coastal communities realized that no sacred site was truly safe, and England's rulers were forced to confront a new maritime threat capable of striking anywhere with little warning. The following year, the Vikings targeted Monkwearmouth Jarrow Abbey. Despite valiant resistance, the monks could not prevent the looters from escaping, though their retreat ended tragically when their ships were wrecked at Tynemouth. This was one of the earliest signs that England was beginning to resist, that locals could occasionally repel or punish invaders. Nevertheless, the broader pattern of Scandinavian predation would not abate. Monastic communities in Ireland and Scotland soon suffered similar attacks. Iona Abbey on Scotland's west coast, a centre of Gaelic learning and piety, was raided in 795, again in 802, and yet again in 806. The surviving monks fled to Kells and Ireland, carrying with them their sacred relics and manuscripts. These incursions not only plundered wealth, but disrupted societies, displacing populations, destabilizing local economies, and sending waves of fear across the British Isles. By the early 9th century, the raiding parties had evolved beyond opportunistic bands into organized forces with ambitions that extended beyond plunder. They sought dominion. Denmark and Sweden, regions now united by maritime culture and increasingly complex political structures, had developed robust trade networks stretching from the North Sea to southern Europe. The Viking longships, with shallow drafts and remarkable speed, allowed them to navigate rivers and strike inland settlements. Their mobility and coordination made them terrifying adversaries, capable of overwhelming even the most fortified Anglo-Saxon positions. It was in this climate of uncertainty and fear that Alfred was born in 849 CE, the youngest son of King Athelwulf of Wessex. His birthplace, a royal estate near Wantage in Berkshire, was part of a network of estates that helped maintain royal authority in southern England. Though Wessex was relatively secure compared to kingdoms already overrun by the Vikings, its proximity to the Thames and the coast meant that Alfred's youth was shaped by constant awareness of external threats. From an early age, he would have been exposed to tales of raids, of the fall of kingdoms, and of the heroic, often tragic, attempts to resist invaders. These formative experiences instilled in him a keen understanding of leadership, strategy, and the fragility of political power. Alfred's early training in leadership and warfare came under the guidance of his elder brothers. King Ethelred, Wessex's eldest surviving son, assumed the throne upon Ethelwulf's death, and Alfred became a critical military subordinate. Their relationship was defined by both familial loyalty and the pressing necessity of defending the kingdom. The weight of responsibility fell particularly heavily on Alfred when, in 865, the Great Heathen Army, described in contemporary sources as the Myselhead Heer, landed in East Anglia. This was no ordinary raiding party. It was a massive coordinated force, commanded by some of the most formidable Viking leaders of the era, including Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and later Guthrum. The army's initial target was Northumbria, where it exploited internal divisions among rival claimants to the throne. The Northumbrian kings Ella and Osbert attempted to resist, but their forces were decisively defeated, and both rulers were killed in 867. York, the city that had served as Northumbria's political and economic hub, fell under Viking control. The news of Northumbria's collapse spread quickly to the southern kingdoms, demonstrating the lethality and ambition of this new kind of invader. No English territory could feel secure. The Vikings were no longer opportunistic marauders, they were conquerors. Following Northumbria, Mercia came under pressure. King Berg, recognizing the Viking threat, allied with Wessex. Alfred and Aethelred joined forces with the Mercians in an effort to repel the invaders, yet their combined armies achieved only temporary success. By 873, Mercia fell completely, and Burgred was deposed, signaling the near-total subjugation of central England. East Anglia faced a similar fate. Its king, Edmund, was killed in 869, leaving the region fully under Viking control. The pattern was clear. Wherever the Vikings went, kingdoms fell, and new political orders emerged under Scandinavian authority. Amid this relentless advance, Wessex became the last major Anglo-Saxon kingdom, resisting the Viking tide. Between 870 and 871, the Vikings overwintered at Reading, occupying a fortified position that threatened the very heart of Wessex. It was during these months that Alfred first demonstrated his military aptitude in practice. Though initial engagements, including early confrontations at Reading itself, ended in Saxon defeats, Alfred played a decisive role at the Battle of Ashdown. According to Esser, Alfred's biographer and advisor, he exhibited extraordinary bravery and tactical insight. He rallied the Saxon troops, coordinated attacks, and inspired confidence, proving that even in the darkest hours, leadership and courage could turn the tide. Despite such moments of triumph, Wessex remained perilously exposed. In 871, King Athelred succumbed to illness, leaving Alfred, barely 22, as king. The situation could hardly have been more precarious. Wessex faced renewed Viking campaigns, the potential collapse of neighboring territories, and the challenge of unifying a kingdom under immense stress. Alfred's ascension marked the beginning of a reign that would be defined not only by military engagement, but also by strategic foresight and political innovation. Alfred's early experience of failure and near collapse had a profound effect on his approach to kingship. He recognized that victory in battle alone was insufficient to guarantee survival. Observation of fallen kingdoms taught him the value of preparation, fortification, and adaptable strategy. These lessons would later manifest in the construction of burhs, fortified settlements designed to protect towns and populations, and in the creation of a naval force capable of intercepting raiders before they could strike inland. Even in his youth, Alfred's vision encompassed not only immediate defense, but long-term security and political stability. By 875, the Great Heathen Army had been reinforced by the Great Summer Army under Guthrum, and the two Viking factions split their forces. Halfdan led a contingent north to consolidate control over Northumbria and establish settlements, laying the groundwork for what would become the Danelaw. Guthrum, meanwhile, turned south toward Wessex, signaling a renewed existential threat to Alfred's kingdom. These developments underscored the stakes. Alfred was no longer dealing with raids or isolated attacks, but with armies intent on conquest and permanent occupation. The climax of this period came in 878 with the surprise winter attack at Chippenham. Alfred was forced to retreat into the marshes of Somerset, adopting guerrilla tactics to preserve his remaining forces. It was a decisive moment that would test every lesson he had learned, every strategic insight, and every ounce of his courage. Yet even at this stage, his qualities were unmistakable. Foresight, adaptability, and an unshakable commitment to the survival of his people. From these early trials emerged the foundation of a legacy that would not only preserve Wessex, but ultimately provide the blueprint for the future unification of the English kingdoms. Alfred's formative years were therefore defined by an interplay of terror and resilience. The violence and upheaval he witnessed were unparalleled, yet they forged a leader capable of extraordinary vision. By absorbing the lessons of fallen kingdoms, understanding the complexities of military and political strategy, and cultivating the loyalty of his followers, Alfred began to shape a kingdom that would withstand a storm. In the crucible of Viking aggression, the young king laid the groundwork for his later achievements, demonstrating that leadership was as much about preparation, adaptability, and foresight as it was about bravery on the battlefield. Alfred in exile and the turning point at Edington. The winter of 878 was one of the darkest periods in the history of Wessex and in the life of its young king, Alfred. At 29 years old, he faced a crisis that threatened not only his reign, but the very survival of his kingdom. The Vikings, under the formidable leadership of Guthrum, had taken advantage of the festive season, launching a surprise winter attack during Christmas at Chippenham. This assault struck at the heart of Wessex when the royal household was least prepared, exploiting both the disorganization of the Saxons and the element of surprise. The invaders overwhelmed the royal center, leaving Alfred with no choice but to flee into the marshlands of Somerset. The marshes of Somerset, a landscape of tangled wetlands, winding rivers and isolated causeways, became Alfred's refuge. Among these wetlands lay the island of Athelney, a remote and difficult-to-access location. In Alfred's time, the island was virtually impenetrable, except by narrow causeways, natural defences that made it an ideal sanctuary for a beleaguered king and his remaining followers. Athelney offered not comfort, but survival, a place where Alfred could regroup and plan. Here, he began to gather the remnants of loyal forces, peasants, retainers, and thanes, men determined to resist despite overwhelming odds. These were not professional armies. They were ordinary men, motivated by loyalty, desperation, and the hope of preserving their homes and families. Alfred's first steps in exile were marked by careful organization and leadership. He established a secondary fortified position at East Ling, near the western end of the Athelney Causeway. This outpost allowed him to monitor Viking movements, launch targeted raids to disrupt enemy supply lines, and maintain communication with potential allies in both Wessex and Mercia. Alfred's ingenuity in choosing these locations reflected his understanding of the terrain. Knowledge of the land would become one of his most potent weapons against the Vikings. Even in the most desperate circumstances, he transformed adversity into strategic advantage. This period of guerrilla warfare was more than mere survival. It was a test of tactical acumen. Alfred's forces struck swiftly and unexpectedly, leveraging the marshes' difficult terrain to ambush Viking detachments and seize resources. Each raid served not only to sustain his men, but also to teach them cohesion, discipline, and the fundamentals of organized resistance. The marshes of Somerset became a crucible, shaping Alfred's understanding of the Vikings' strengths and weaknesses, and honing the combat readiness of his otherwise improvised forces. By Easter of 878, Alfred judged that he had amassed sufficient strength to confront Guthrum in open battle. He selected Ethandune, now generally identified as Eddington on the edge of Salisbury Plain, as the site for this decisive engagement. Alfred's choice of battlefield reflected his strategic mind. He positioned his forces to exploit natural defensive features, organized his men into disciplined formations, and employed elements of surprise. Contemporary chroniclers note that despite being outnumbered, Alfred's forces held firm, combining defensive resilience with timely counterattacks that capitalized on Viking overconfidence. The Battle of Eddington was a turning point, not only for Alfred's reign, but for the future of Wessex and the English kingdoms. The Saxon forces routed Guthrum's army, forcing the Vikings to retreat and marking one of the first major successes against a previously unstoppable foe. Alfred's leadership, tactical insight, and ability to inspire his troops had transformed a desperate situation into a monumental victory. The psychological effect was equally profound. Wessex had survived, demonstrating that the Vikings, despite their reputation and power, were not invincible. Following the victory, Alfred's approach to the Vikings was characterized by pragmatism and foresight. Rather than pursuing total annihilation, he negotiated with Guthrum to establish a durable peace that recognized the realities of power. This led to a formal treaty that delineated the boundaries of influence between Wessex and the Viking-controlled territories. As part of this agreement, Guthrum underwent baptism, symbolically embracing Christianity, a move that was both politically shrewd and culturally significant. By incorporating elements of religious symbolism into diplomacy, Alfred not only secured peace, but also reinforced his legitimacy and moral authority. The treaty established clear and pragmatic boundaries. Viking influence was recognized across East Anglia and Northumbria, while Wessex retained the south and west. Natural features, rivers such as the Thames, Lea, and Ouse, were used to demarcate these territories. creating a line that allowed both sides to consolidate power without immediate conflict. This arrangement became the foundation for the territory later known as the Danelaw, a recognition that the Vikings would not be expelled entirely but could be integrated into the existing political framework under defined terms. Alfred's skillful negotiation transformed what could have been a temporary military victory into a lasting political settlement. Alfred's diplomatic acumen extended beyond treaty-making. He cultivated alliances with neighboring kingdoms, particularly Mercia, solidifying Wessex's influence through both diplomacy and family ties. His daughter, Ethelflaed, married Ethelred, Ealdorman of Mercia, establishing a political partnership that strengthened resistance against Viking incursions. Ethelflaed would later become Lady of the Mercians, exercising authority in her own right and continuing her father's policies. Through marriage, diplomacy, and military cooperation, Alfred forged a network of alliances that extended Wessex's reach and ensured a coordinated approach to regional security. However, Alfred's vision was not limited to immediate military and diplomatic measures. Recognizing that long-term security required systemic change, he initiated the construction of a network of burhs, fortified towns strategically positioned to withstand Viking attacks. Some burhs were established on old Roman sites, others on high ground, earthworks or palisades. These fortifications served multiple purposes. They protected local populations, provided garrison points for military forces, and functioned as centers for trade and administration. The Burgulhiddige, a contemporary record, meticulously details the sizes, garrisons, and maintenance obligations for these fortresses. Towns like Wareham in Dorset, along with others across Wessex, exemplify Alfred's comprehensive approach to defensive infrastructure. In addition to the burhs, Alfred implemented a reorganized militia system known as the fyrd, ensuring that half of the peasant army remained active at all times. This continuous readiness meant that Wessex could respond quickly to Viking movements, reducing the risk of surprise attacks. To support both the burhs and the standing military forces, Alfred established a taxation and conscription system that linked resource management to defensive preparedness. Together, these measures represented a holistic approach to kingdom defense, blending military innovation, civil administration, and social organization. The victory at Edington and the subsequent treaty with Guthrum were more than just political or military achievements. They marked the transformation of Wessex from a kingdom on the brink of collapse into a resilient power capable of enduring repeated threats. Guthrum's conversion to Christianity and the formalized boundaries set a precedent for engagement with Viking leaders across England. Alfred had proven that effective leadership combined military skill, strategic foresight, and diplomatic intelligence. Alfred's actions during this crisis laid the foundation for subsequent successes. From the marshes of Somerset to the plains of Edington, he had demonstrated that careful planning, disciplined leadership, and innovative defensive strategies could counter even the most formidable adversaries. These early trials were instrumental in forging the administrative and military structures that would allow Wessex to survive, recover, and eventually expand its influence. By the end of this period, Alfred had not only secured the immediate survival of Wessex, but had also created a model for governance, military organization, and diplomacy that would influence generations of English rulers. The victory at Edington, the construction of burhs, the establishment of the fyrd, and his alliances with neighboring powers collectively transformed the kingdom from a beleaguered state into a bastion of resistance against Viking domination. Alfred's legacy, therefore, was forged in both the crucible of exile and the triumph of strategic foresight, setting the stage for the eventual unification of England under his descendants. Alfred's victory at Edington in 878 was more than a tactical success on the battlefield. It marked the beginning of a transformative reign that would leave a lasting imprint on England. Whereas many rulers of the period were primarily concerned with immediate military survival, Alfred possessed a vision that extended far beyond the exigencies of the moment. He understood that true security demanded a holistic approach, a combination of military preparedness, administrative efficiency, legal consistency, cultural and educational renewal, and spiritual cohesion. In Alfred's mind, a strong kingdom could not be built on arms alone. It required governance, knowledge, and an integrated society. Fortifications and the burh system. The traumatic events at Chippenham left a deep impression on Alfred. The surprise winter attack underscored the vulnerabilities of Wessex towns and villages, revealing the necessity of a systematic defensive strategy. Alfred's response was both innovative and comprehensive. He initiated the construction of a network of fortified settlements known as burhs. These were not merely castles or walls, but carefully planned communities that combined defensive utility with economic and administrative functions. Each burh was strategically located to serve multiple purposes. Coastal burhs, for example, acted as early warning posts against Viking ships approaching by sea, while inland burhs protected critical trade routes and river crossings. Some burhs were established on ancient Roman sites, taking advantage of existing earthworks and infrastructure, while others were built from scratch on high ground or naturally defensible locations. This network ensured that no part of Wessex was left entirely vulnerable, creating a sense of order and security previously unknown. The Burgle Hiddage, a detailed contemporary record, enumerates the requirements for garrisons in each burh, specifying the number of men needed for its defense relative to the length of its walls. This precise organization reflects Alfred's methodical approach. He understood that fortifications alone were useless without trained defenders. By integrating local populations into the defense, he empowered communities to protect themselves while simultaneously reducing the strain on the central royal army. Towns such as Wareham in Dorset remain as enduring testaments to this vision, where the earthworks still hint at the strategic ingenuity of Alfred's planning. Military organization. The Fyrd and naval initiatives. Alongside burhs, Alfred reformed Wessex militia system, known as the Fyrd, to ensure a sustainable and flexible defense. Previously, the Fyrd required all freemen to serve simultaneously for fixed periods. While effective in theory, this system left large areas of the kingdom exposed when men were away on campaign. Alfred introduced a rotation system. Half the men would remain on active duty, while the other half tended the fields and local defenses. This innovation maintained a ready fighting force at all times, balanced military needs with economic stability, and prevented the depletion of manpower that had previously hampered Wessex's resilience. Alfred also recognized that the Vikings were not only a land-based threat, but masters of the sea. To counter this, he embarked on naval development, commissioning the construction of larger and more robust warships capable of carrying both soldiers and supplies. These vessels were designed for maneuverability and endurance, superior in key respects to the longships employed by the raiders. Alfred paired his fleet with a system of coastal lookout posts and signal networks, providing early warnings and enabling rapid defensive responses to Viking incursions. The combination of burhs, a disciplined militia, and a capable navy created a multi-layered security framework that few contemporary kingdoms could match. Legal and administrative reforms. Alfred's vision extended beyond military preparedness. He understood that law and governance were central to societal stability and the long-term security of Wessex. He undertook the codification of existing Anglo-Saxon laws, supplementing them with his own dooms, legal judgments emphasizing justice, fairness, and protection for the vulnerable. Alfred's laws balanced the interests of the king, nobility, and common people, reinforcing community responsibility and promoting social cohesion in a period otherwise characterized by chaos and Viking depredations. Administration and taxation were also transformed. Alfred linked fiscal obligations directly to military and civil responsibilities, ensuring that the burhs were maintained and the fyrd supported. By centralizing resource management while coordinating with local lords, Alfred created a more organized and reliable governance system. These reforms embedded order and authority in Wessex, setting a precedent for subsequent English kings and laying the foundations of a state capable of sustained defense and administration. Intellectual revival and promotion of learning. Alfred's vision of resilience was not limited to the battlefield or bureaucracy. It extended deeply into education and culture. The Viking raids had destroyed monasteries, plundered libraries, and disrupted centers of learning. Alfred recognized that knowledge was both a practical and moral cornerstone of effective governance. A literate and informed elite could administer the kingdom, advise on law, and support religious and cultural continuity. To address this, Alfred commissioned translations of critical works from Latin into Old English, making knowledge accessible to a broader audience. These works included Boethius' Consolation of Philosophy, Pope Gregory's Pastoral Care, and Beded's Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorum. Alfred provided commentary alongside translations, emphasizing lessons in morality, governance, and spiritual life. This effort was revolutionary. By prioritizing the vernacular, Alfred nurtured an educated class capable of administrative competence, religious leadership, and cultural stewardship. Alfred's personal literacy was exceptional. He was proficient in Latin, yet he consciously chose to empower his people by teaching in Old English, demonstrating a rare blend of intellectual curiosity, practical foresight, and cultural patriotism. This investment in education ensured that Wessex could recover from the intellectual disruptions caused by decades of Viking raids, fostering continuity and resilience for generations. Religious and cultural leadership. Alfred's reforms extended into the church, which he viewed as integral to societal cohesion. He re-established monastic communities, promoted the production of religious texts, and encouraged moral education throughout his kingdom. His personal piety was genuine. He sought to embody a model of kingship that integrated spiritual integrity with political and military leadership. Bishop Asa, Alfred's contemporary biographer, praised the king's devotion and wisdom, highlighting how his example guided both subjects and fellow rulers. By intertwining spiritual and temporal authority, Alfred reinforced the moral and social fabric of Wessex, ensuring that his kingdom's revival was not only military, but also cultural and ethical. Personal struggles, illness, and resilience. Despite these achievements, Alfred faced chronic personal hardships. Asa describes a persistent painful condition that may have been Crohn's disease, which afflicted the king throughout his life. Remarkably, Alfred continued to lead his kingdom, overseeing military reforms, administrative organization, and cultural initiatives despite recurring illness. His perseverance inspired loyalty and admiration among his people, demonstrating that leadership required not only intellect and courage, but also the ability to endure adversity with steadfast resolve. By the late 880s, Alfred had secured Wessex and extended his influence into neighboring territories. Through the strategic marriage of his daughter Athelflaed to Ethelred, Ealdorman of Mercia, Alfred effectively brought western Mercia under Wessex influence. While he did not claim kingship over Mercia, his guidance and political oversight strengthened the kingdom's ability to resist Viking incursions. Ethelflaed herself would emerge as a formidable leader, later known as the Lady of the Mercians, who continued Alfred's policies and reinforced Anglo-Saxon authority across central England. Alfred also took decisive action in London, reoccupying the city after the Danes vacated it. He transformed London into a hub of administration, trade, and military organization. By integrating urban centers into his defensive and political strategy, Alfred demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of geopolitics, military security, economic vitality, and administrative authority were all intertwined. Through his military, administrative, legal, and cultural reforms, Alfred transformed Wessex from a kingdom on the brink of collapse into a model of resilience and governance. The burghs, the rotation-based fyrd, the naval initiatives, the legal codifications, and the promotion of learning collectively created a kingdom that could withstand external threats and recover from internal instability. These innovations laid the foundation for his successors, including Edward, the Elder, and Ethelflaed, to consolidate power, extend English authority over Viking-held territories, and gradually pave the way for the eventual unification of England. Alfred's reign was thus characterized not merely by survival or military victories, but by a strategic vision for long-term stability, combining defense, governance, culture, law, and education. In an era when kingdoms could fall overnight to raiders, Alfred demonstrated that careful planning, disciplined leadership, and intellectual investment could transform a vulnerable state into a resilient polity. His reforms would resonate through centuries, earning him the epithet the Great and establishing him as a central figure in the formation of an English nation. Alfred understood that a kingdom's survival depended not only on walls and armies, but also on knowledge. The Viking raids of the previous decades had devastated monasteries, destroyed libraries, and interrupted the transmission of learning. Many texts and manuscripts were lost forever, and literacy, especially among the nobility, had suffered. Alfred recognized that a literate, educated class was essential for administration, diplomacy, and governance. He also understood that education must be accessible, not confined to Latin-speaking clergy, but available to those who would manage and defend the kingdom. To address this, Alfred initiated a deliberate cultural revival, often called the Alfredian Renaissance. He invited scholars and clerics from across England and the continent to his court. Together, they undertook translations of essential works from Latin into Old English, the vernacular language of Wessex, thereby extending literacy and knowledge to a broader segment of society. Among the most important works translated under Alfred's direction were Boethius' Consolation of Philosophy, offering moral guidance, reflections on fortune and fate, and philosophical instruction for rulers and nobles. Alfred's commentary emphasized resilience, moral duty, and prudent governance. Gregory the Great's Pastoral Care, a handbook for clergy, advising on spiritual duties, leadership, and moral guidance. Alfred's translation ensured that priests and bishops could administer their parishes effectively, enhancing social cohesion. Bedid's Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorum, chronicling the history of the English Church and the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, providing a sense of national identity, continuity, and purpose. Alfred's adaptation included explanations to contextualize historical events for contemporary audiences. Alfred's translations were not literal copies. They were carefully adapted with commentary and ethical reflections woven in. His goal was not merely to preserve knowledge, but to cultivate moral and intellectual capacity, preparing leaders for governance, warfare, and spiritual responsibility. He also promoted literacy more widely. Schools were established in towns and burghs, producing a generation of scribes, administrators, and clergy capable of sustaining governance, law, and historical record-keeping. This initiative helped stabilize the kingdom culturally and administratively, ensuring that Wessex could recover from the disruption caused by Viking raids. Alfred's promotion of learning extended to practical knowledge as well, including military organization, navigation, and administration, reflecting his vision of a well-rounded and educated elite. Economic measures and coinage. Alfred recognized that all reforms, military, educational, or administrative, depended on economic stability. To this end, he undertook reforms in coinage, standardizing currency to ensure reliable trade and efficient taxation. Coins minted in Alfred's name circulated throughout Wessex and areas of Mercia under his influence, reinforcing both his authority and the economic cohesion of his kingdom. Viking raids had disrupted commerce and destroyed wealth, but treasure hoards, such as the Croydon Hoard discovered in 1862, reveal that England still possessed substantial resources. Alfred's reforms enabled the kingdom to recover, providing the means to maintain burghs, fund the navy, and support a trained and disciplined militia. By integrating economic planning with military and civic administration, Alfred ensured that Wessex could sustain itself during both peace and conflict. Alfred also promoted trade and infrastructure. He recognized that stable markets, secure roads, and functional river crossings were vital for both commerce and defense. By tying economic health to military readiness, Alfred created a kingdom in which prosperity and security reinforced one another. Diplomacy and relations with the Vikings. Alfred's strategy for dealing with the Vikings was not purely militaristic. He understood that diplomacy and negotiation were essential components of survival. His dealings with Guthrum after Edington exemplified this approach. Instead of seeking total annihilation, Alfred negotiated a treaty that delineated boundaries, allowed the Vikings to control East Anglia and parts of the north, and required Guthrum's baptism as a sign of Christian acceptance and political legitimacy. This pragmatic diplomacy was critical. It stabilized Wessex, allowing Alfred to consolidate his reforms without constant invasion. At the same time, it established a precedent for engagement with Viking leaders that balanced confrontation with negotiation, demonstrating that strategic compromise could preserve the kingdom while still asserting authority. Alfred's approach influenced subsequent rulers, setting the stage for the eventual reconquest of the Danelaw and the broader unification of England. Consolidation of succession and mentoring the next generation. Alfred knew that his accomplishments would only endure if his successors were prepared to maintain and expand them. He took an active role in mentoring his children, imparting knowledge of governance, military strategy, law, and diplomacy. Edward the Elder, his eldest son, inherited a kingdom strengthened by Alfred's burghs, organized fyrd, and legal and economic reforms. Athelney, his eldest daughter, was trained in leadership and diplomacy, later ruling Mercia as the Lady of the Mercians. She successfully extended Wessex influence over central England, continuing her father's policies, maintaining resistance against Viking incursions, and demonstrating the effectiveness of Alfred's vision for leadership education. By cultivating the skills of his heirs, Alfred ensured continuity in governance, military readiness, and cultural revival. This deliberate attention to succession planning prevented the fragmentation that had plagued other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and safeguarded the future of English unity. Personal challenges and final years. Despite these achievements, Alfred's final years were marked by persistent personal suffering. Contemporary sources describe a chronic illness, widely believed by modern historians to have been Crohn's disease, which caused recurring abdominal pain and weakness. Even so, Alfred remained deeply engaged in all aspects of governance. He continued overseeing the construction of burghs, training the fyrd, managing legal reforms, supervising coinage, and directing educational initiatives. His resilience in the face of illness reinforced his reputation as a steadfast and wise ruler. Chroniclers, and later historians alike, emphasized that Alfred's dedication, even when physically impaired, inspired loyalty among his people and respect among neighboring rulers. His ability to balance personal suffering with the demands of kingship became a defining feature of his legend. Alfred passed away in 899, after a reign of 3 decades that had transformed Wessex from a vulnerable kingdom into a model of military, administrative, and cultural resilience. He was buried in Winchester, the principal royal city, originally in the Old Minster on the site of the present cathedral. His death marked the end of a transformative era, but his reforms, institutions, and mentorship ensured that his legacy endured. Alfred's achievements were unparalleled among early English monarchs. He combined military acumen with legal reform, economic oversight, educational initiatives, and religious devotion. He demonstrated that leadership required vision, intellect, and resilience, qualities that allowed him not only to survive the Viking threat, but to transform his kingdom into a lasting model of governance. Through his innovations, the burr system, the reformed ford, a structured navy, codified laws, and the promotion of literacy, Alfred established the foundation for the eventual unification of England under his descendants. His children, Edward the Elder and Ethelflaed, continued his work, expanding Wessex influence and gradually reclaiming Viking-held territories. Alfred's epithet, the Great, was unique among English rulers of the early medieval period, reflecting not only his military prowess, but also his role as a visionary statesman, scholar, and reformer. He was a king who understood that the survival and prosperity of a people depended on the integration of defense, law, culture, and education. His reign became a benchmark for what a wise and effective monarchy could achieve, and his influence resonated through generations, shaping the trajectory of England long after his death. Alfred's death in 899 marked the end of a transformative era in Anglo-Saxon England. Yet, while the king himself had passed, the systems, structures, and cultural foundations he established ensured that his influence endured far beyond his lifetime. Wessex, once the most imperiled of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, had become the strongest, best defended, and most administratively sophisticated realm on the island. It was from this platform that the eventual unification of England would emerge, a vision Alfred had initiated, even if he did not live to see it completed. One of Alfred's most pragmatic decisions was the recognition and accommodation of Viking power through the establishment of the Danelaw. But, following his victory at Edington and the treaty with Guthrum, he acknowledged the reality of Scandinavian settlement across eastern and northern England. The Danelaw spanned East Anglia, Northumbria, and parts of Mercia, administered by Viking leaders who gradually adopted aspects of Anglo-Saxon governance while maintaining their own Scandinavian traditions. Guthrum's baptism and conversion to Christianity was both symbolic and practical, reflecting a blending of cultures and the beginnings of peaceful coexistence. Rather than pursuing total expulsion, which would have required decades of continuous warfare, Alfred created a framework for regulated coexistence. The Danelaw became a controlled region rather than a lawless frontier. By stabilizing this area, Alfred allowed Wessex and Mercia to concentrate on rebuilding, strengthening defenses, and consolidating administration in regions under direct Anglo-Saxon control. Over time, Viking settlers integrated with the local population, influencing language, law, place names, and cultural practices, leaving a lasting imprint on English society. Alfred's diplomatic foresight here was revolutionary for the period. He recognized that survival and prosperity depended not only on military strength, but also on negotiation, cultural integration, and political pragmatism. By creating a system where conflict could be minimized and coexistence structured, he laid the groundwork for later generations to gradually reclaim and assimilate Viking-held territories. Edward the Elder and Ethelflaed, continuing Alfred's vision. Alfred's foresight extended to preparing his heirs to continue the work of unifying England. His eldest son, Edward the Elder, inherited a kingdom strengthened by fortified burhs, an organized and rotating militia, and a functioning legal system. Edward understood the importance of Alfred's reforms and expanded upon them, extending influence into Mercia and areas formerly dominated by Viking forces. Meanwhile, Alfred's daughter, Æthelflæd, the Lady of the Mercians, became a formidable ruler in her own right. She governed western Mercia, constructing fortifications, organizing the local fyrd, and overseeing civic administration. Her leadership demonstrated the practical transmission of Alfred's principles of governance, military preparedness, and cultural patronage. Æthelflæd's accomplishments were remarkable for the era, exemplifying Alfred's strategy of empowering capable regional leaders to maintain stability and extend influence. Together, Edward and Æthelflæd began the process of reintegrating territories previously under Viking control. By combining military action, fortified settlements, strategic alliances, and marriage diplomacy, they slowly knitted a patchwork of Anglo-Saxon realms into a more cohesive political entity. Alfred's emphasis on education, leadership development, and strategic foresight ensured that this next generation could build upon his foundations, gradually paving the way for a unified English kingdom. Military innovation and the legacy of defense. Alfred's military innovations were central to the survival and future expansion of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The Burh system, a network of fortified settlements, remained the backbone of Wessex defense and became a model for subsequent expansion into Mercia and beyond. Each burh served multiple purposes. It was a defensive stronghold, a hub for trade, and a center of administration. Their strategic placement along rivers, trade routes, and vulnerable frontiers ensured rapid response to any raiding force. Complementing these fortifications was the reformed fyrd, a militia system organized to maintain half the men on active duty while the rest tended their lands. This innovation allowed continuous defense without crippling agricultural productivity. Alfred's naval initiatives were equally forward-thinking. He commissioned larger and more maneuverable ships to counter Viking seaborne raids, creating one of the earliest organized maritime defense systems in England. The Burgle Hiddage, Alfred's detailed survey of burh garrisons, codified military organization in unprecedented detail for early medieval Europe. By combining professional soldiers, locally raised militias, and strategically located fortresses, Alfred ensured that Wessex, and later territories under Edward and Æthelflæd, remained resilient against Viking aggression. This defensive network provided both immediate protection and a platform for reclaiming lost territories. Legal and administrative foundations. Alfred's codification of law and governance established structures that outlasted his reign. His legal codes blended Christian moral principles with the practical realities of a fragmented, war-torn society. They emphasized fairness, accountability, and community responsibility, providing a consistent legal framework across Wessex and its spheres of influence. These reforms extended into administrative systems that tied taxation, military obligations, and local governance together. By creating a model kingdom capable of projecting authority beyond its borders, Alfred laid the foundation for a centralized Anglo-Saxon state. These structures would prove invaluable under his grandson Aethelstan, who would later assert authority over all English territories, finally creating a united England in 927. Alfred's commitment to learning transformed Anglo-Saxon society. By translating the essential texts into Old English, he ensured that literacy and knowledge were accessible to a broader audience, including clergy, administrators, and nobility. His educational reforms created a culture in which governance, military strategy, and ethical leadership were informed by historical, philosophical, and religious understanding. The Alfredian Renaissance, as it came to be called, laid the groundwork for subsequent cultural and intellectual revival. His emphasis on historical memory, religious instruction, and practical knowledge produced a literate, informed society capable of sustaining institutions of governance, the church, and legal system. Alfred's vision was not limited to immediate survival. It encompassed the long-term cultivation of a coherent English identity. The institutions, fortifications, and administrative systems Alfred established enabled his successors to gradually consolidate England. Edward the Elder extended Wessex authority into Mercia and Eastern territories, while Ethelflaed reinforced Mercian strength and maintained secure frontiers. Their coordinated efforts reclaimed Viking-held territories and integrated them under Anglo-Saxon control. Alfred's grandson, Aethelstan, would ultimately unify England, capturing York and asserting authority over remaining Viking territories, creating the first truly Anglo-Saxon kingdom of England in 927. Beyond military conquest, Alfred's emphasis on law, education, and civic organization ensured enduring cultural and institutional cohesion. His reign demonstrated that survival and unification required a combination of strategy, governance, diplomacy, and cultural vision, rather than mere martial prowess. Alfred's accomplishments earned him recognition unparalleled among early medieval English monarchs. The epithet, the Great, reflects not only his military victories, but also his strategic foresight, legal reforms, educational initiatives, and religious devotion. No other ruler of his time achieved comparable breadth in consolidating power, stabilizing society, and cultivating culture. Medieval chroniclers, notably Bishop Asser, portrayed Alfred as a king who combined Christian virtue with practical wisdom, balancing piety with the rigorous demands of kingship. Later historians have acknowledged him as the architect of English unity, whose systems of defense, governance, and learning provided the foundation for the eventual emergence of a single English kingdom. Alfred's reign became a benchmark for monarchy itself, a model of resilience, vision, and the careful integration of military, legal, administrative, and cultural leadership. Alfred the Great's influence extended far beyond the 3 decades of his reign. By establishing fortified networks, codifying law, promoting education, stabilizing the economy, and cultivating capable successors, he transformed Wessex into a kingdom capable of enduring and eventually leading the unification of England. His vision of leadership combined courage, intellect, faith, and foresight, setting a standard that resonated through the Anglo-Saxon period and beyond. Through his efforts, England survived the Viking onslaught, developed a cohesive identity, and laid the institutional and cultural groundwork for a unified kingdom under his descendants. Alfred's legacy was not merely that of a warrior king, but of a statesman, scholar, and visionary, whose life and work ensured that England would endure and eventually flourish long after his passing. Alfred the Great's life is, above all, a story of resilience, vision, and enduring impact. Born in 849 at a royal estate near Wantage, he came of age during one of the most turbulent periods in English history. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, and East Anglia, were independent and often at odds with one another, fragmented in power, culture, and law. Into this volatile landscape came the external threat of Viking raiders, seaborne warriors, whose sudden devastating attacks transformed the political, economic, and cultural fabric of the British Isles. From the shocking sacking of Lindisfarne in 793 to the arrival of the Great Heathen Army in 865, the forces of disruption and violence shaped Alfred's formative years. These events instilled in him an acute awareness of the precariousness of kingship and the necessity of foresight, strategy, and unity. Alfred's story is in many ways the story of England itself, a small, fractured land struggling to defend its people, preserve its culture, and forge a cohesive identity under extraordinary pressure. Throughout his life, Alfred combined political and military acumen with deep religious devotion. He viewed his role as king, not only in terms of governance, but as a moral and spiritual responsibility. Bishop Asser's biography portrays Alfred as a ruler whose piety, wisdom, and ethical integrity guided his decisions, balancing practical concerns with moral imperatives. His reforms in law, education, and religion reflect a vision in which kingdom and faith were intertwined, and in which the prosperity and survival of his people were inseparable from moral governance. Alfred's epithet, the Great, remains singular in English history. No other early medieval English monarch was so celebrated in his own lifetime and afterward. His accomplishments were holistic. He defended and preserved his kingdom, reformed its administration and legal systems, revitalized learning and culture, and laid the groundwork for the eventual unification of England. He serves as a symbol of resilient leadership, showing how vision, intellect, and courage can shape the destiny of a nation even amid extreme adversity. Alfred's legacy is tangible in the fortifications that protected England, the laws that governed it, the education systems that nurtured future leaders, and the unity that his descendants would achieve. Alfred's influence extends far beyond his own era. The burghs, the legal codes, the educational reforms, and the diplomatic practices he implemented endured, influencing the governance and culture of England for generations. Even centuries later, historians recognize Alfred as the architect of the English nation, a figure whose achievements combined the practical demands of leadership with the visionary ambition of a true statesman. In sum, Alfred the Great exemplifies the qualities that would define effective kingship: wisdom in counsel, courage in battle, prudence in governance, and devotion to learning and faith. His story is not merely one of survival against overwhelming odds. It is a narrative of creation and consolidation, of a king who forged order from chaos, laying the enduring foundations of a unified England. Thank you for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. We release new videos daily. A warrior king in a world of violence. Alfred's ascent to the throne of Wessex was forged in the crucible of conflict. Following the death of his elder brother, Ethelred, Alfred assumed kingship at the age of 22, inheriting a kingdom under existential threat from Viking invasions. The early years of his reign were marked by constant warfare, strategic retreats, and the need for rapid adaptation. Battles like Ashdown, where Alfred fought alongside his brother against Viking forces, revealed both his tactical acumen and personal courage. Yet perhaps the defining moment of Alfred's early kingship was the winter of 878, when Guthrum's army launched a surprise attack at Chippenham. Alfred was forced to flee into the marshes of Somerset, finding refuge on the island of Athelney. Surrounded by difficult terrain and commanding only a small band of loyal followers, he orchestrated a campaign of guerrilla warfare, striking Viking detachments, disrupting supply lines, and rallying his people. This period of exile was not a defeat, but a crucible in which Alfred's resilience, ingenuity, and leadership were owned. Emerging from the marshes, Alfred confronted Guthrum's forces at the decisive Battle of Edington. Here, his mastery of strategy, positioning, and disciplined troop formations overcame the Vikings' superior numbers. The victory at Edington not only safeguarded Wessex, but also enabled the negotiation of a lasting peace, culminating in Guthrum's baptism and the formal delineation of boundaries, a treaty that recognized the Danelaw while securing Alfred's kingdom. Alfred's military innovations were integral to this survival. The network of burghs, fortified settlements, allowed Wessex to withstand future Viking raids. The reformed fyrd ensured continuous defense without crippling the agricultural economy, while his naval developments created one of the earliest organized maritime defense systems in England. Alfred's approach demonstrated a profound understanding. Survival required foresight, planning, and coordination, not simply courage on the battlefield. His methods laid the foundation for future English military organization, establishing principles that would endure for generations. Alfred's legacy was not solely martial. He was a lawgiver, administrator, and cultural patron whose reforms transformed Wessex into a resilient, well-governed kingdom. His legal codes blended Christian morality with practical governance, establishing justice as the foundation for political stability. By creating a consistent framework for adjudication, Alfred reinforced central authority while promoting fairness and community responsibility. Equally important was Alfred's dedication to learning and literacy. Recognizing that knowledge was vital for effective governance, he commissioned translations of key Latin texts into Old English, making works by Bede, Boethius, and Pope Gregory accessible to nobles, clergy, and administrators. These translations were not mere linguistic exercises. Alfred included commentary, moral reflections, and practical guidance for governance and ethical leadership. By establishing schools in towns and burhs, he ensured that education extended beyond the royal court, cultivating an informed elite capable of sustaining administration, law, and ecclesiastical authority. This period, often referred to as the Alfredian Renaissance, reinforced the intellectual and spiritual foundations of Wessex and set a precedent for cultural revival throughout England. Alfred's vision extended beyond his own reign. He meticulously prepared the next generation to continue his work of defense, governance, and cultural revival. His son, Edward the Elder, inherited a fortified, administratively organized kingdom and expanded Wessex's influence into Mercia and previously Viking-held territories. Alfred's daughter, Ethelflaed, the Lady of the Mercians, assumed leadership in western Mercia, demonstrating administrative and military competence. She constructed burhs, organized local militias, and maintained the security and prosperity of her domain. Together, Edward and Ethelflaed gradually reintegrated Viking-controlled areas into a network of Anglo-Saxon governance. Through these efforts, Alfred laid the groundwork for Aethelstan, his grandson, to unify England. By capturing York and asserting authority over the remaining Viking territories, Aethelstan became the first ruler of a fully unified England in 927. Alfred's vision of a cohesive Anglo-Saxon identity, expressed in his self-styling as King of the Anglo-Saxons, was thus realized, demonstrating that foresight, preparation, and institution building could transcend the immediate challenges of his own life. Throughout his life, Alfred combined political and military acumen with deep religious devotion. He viewed kingship as a moral responsibility, guiding his people not only through strategy and governance, but also through ethical example. Bishop Asser portrays him as a ruler whose piety and wisdom informed every decision, balancing practical concerns with moral imperatives. Alfred's reforms in law, education, and religion reflect this integration. Governance and faith were inseparable. A well-ordered kingdom depended on ethical conduct, informed leadership, and adherence to Christian principles. In Alfred's conception of kingship, survival and prosperity were rooted as much in morality and cultural cohesion as in the strength of arms. Alfred's epithet, the Great, remains singular in English history. No other early medieval English monarch achieved comparable success in combining military strategy, legal reform, cultural patronage, and religious devotion. His accomplishments were holistic. He defended and preserved his kingdom, revitalized learning and culture, reformed governance and law, and laid the foundation for eventual unification. He became a symbol of resilient leadership, demonstrating that intellect, foresight, courage, and moral integrity could shape the destiny of a nation even amid overwhelming adversity. Alfred's achievements were tangible: burhs that protected England, laws that governed it, schools that nurtured leaders, and a vision of unity that his descendants would ultimately fulfill. Alfred's influence endured far beyond his death in 899. The burhs, legal codes, educational reforms, and diplomatic practices he implemented persisted, shaping the governance, defense, and culture of England for generations. Historians have rightly recognized him as the architect of the English nation, a figure whose accomplishments combine the practical demands of kingship with visionary ambition. In essence, Alfred exemplifies the qualities of effective kingship: wisdom in counsel, courage in battle, prudence in governance, and devotion to learning and faith. His story is not merely one of survival, but of creation and consolidation, a narrative in which a single king forged order from chaos and laid the enduring foundations of a unified England. Alfred's reign teaches us that leadership is both immediate and enduring. It requires action in the present and preparation for the future. It demands bravery, foresight, and a commitment to the welfare of one's people. Through his life and work, Alfred the Great ensured that the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms would survive the Viking threat and ultimately coalesce into the England we know today. So here we are. Once again, we find ourselves at the end of the road. England did prevail, and Alfred's legacy will forever be remembered as one of history's greatest, not only for his military mind and strategic ability, but for his sharp intellect and for his resolve. Can you for a second only imagine a world where Alfred failed to preserve the Saxon national identity? What would that world have looked like? Would Christianity spread the same way it did? Or would the Old Norse religion be the world-spanning religion that Christianity are today? Perhaps not so likely, but it is interesting to think about. With the entire British island under its control, it sure would be a powerful base of operations for the Vikings and the Norse religion to spread further. Anyways, I would again like to take the opportunity to thank you all for being here. I really do appreciate it a lot. And if you haven't yet already, please like the video and consider subscribing for daily uploads like this one. Have a good night's sleep, and I will see you all in the next one. Good night.